The Dark Night in Boston. Matt was an experienced traveler who enjoyed exploring new cities and staying in unique Airbnbs. This time he found himself in Boston, Massachusetts, staying in a historic brownstone in Beacon Hill. The building was charming, with its brick facade, narrow staircases, and old-world charm. The listing boasted a blend of modern amenities with vintage aesthetics, and the location was perfect for his weekend getaway. Matt had planned to meet up with some college friends for a reunion, but as the evening wore on, the others bailed one by one. Instead of heading out alone, he decided to spend a quiet night in. He picked up some takeout, grabbed a couple of local craft beers, and returned to his apartment to relax. The brownstone was divided into several small apartments, and Matt's unit was on the top floor. It was cozy but a bit cramped, with creaky wooden floors and windows that offered a view of the narrow cobblestone streets below. The building's age gave it character, but it also gave Matt a slight unease, as if the walls held onto memories from decades past. After eating, Matt settled on the couch to watch a movie, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had been nagging at him since he arrived. The night was quiet, the only sound being the occasional footsteps from the apartment below. The thin walls didn't provide much privacy, and Matt could hear someone moving around downstairs, but he shrugged it off as just another tenant coming home late. It was around midnight when Matt decided to call it a night. He climbed into the small, old-fashioned bed in the corner of the room, the frame creaking under his weight. The streetlight outside cast a faint glow through the curtains, creating shadows that danced on the walls. He closed his eyes, hoping to drift off quickly. Just as he was about to fall asleep, he heard a faint noise, like someone was trying to open the door to his apartment. He sat up, heart pounding, and listened closely. The noise stopped, and for a moment he thought he might have imagined it. But then he heard it again, this time louder. Someone was definitely at the door, fiddling with the lock. His mind raced. Was it another guest who got the wrong apartment? Or was it something more sinister? Matt slipped out of bed as quietly as possible, grabbing his phone from the nightstand. He walked toward the door, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. He could hear the sound of someone trying to pick the lock, the metal scraping softly in the silence of the night. He hesitated, then decided to speak up. "Hey, who's there?" he called out, trying to sound confident even though his voice wavered. The noise stopped immediately. There was a long, tense silence, and Matt held his breath, waiting for a response. But there was nothing, just the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Matt backed away from the door, unsure of what to do. He considered calling the police, but he didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just a mistake, and whoever it was had realized they had the wrong place. But then he heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on the door, followed by a low voice that sent chills down his spine. "Let me in, Matt." His blood ran cold. How did this person know his name? Panic surged through him as he realized that this wasn't a simple mistake. Someone was targeting him. He quickly dialed 911, his hands shaking as he explained the situation to the operator. They assured him that police were on their way, but in the meantime, he needed to stay calm and stay on the line. As he backed away from the door, he heard the person on the other side trying the handle again, more forcefully this time. The door rattled in its frame, the old wood groaning under the pressure. Matt's eyes darted around the room, looking for something he could use to defend himself. The only thing nearby was an old, heavy candlestick on the dresser. He grabbed it, holding it tightly as he moved further away from the door. The operator's voice in his ear was calm, but it did little to soothe his mounting terror. "Stay with me, Matt. The police are just a few minutes away." But those minutes felt like hours, as the person outside grew more aggressive, pounding on the door, trying to force their way in. Matt could hear the wood splintering, the lock starting to give way. He knew it was only a matter of time before the door gave in. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Matt strained to hear anything, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no voice, nothing. "Are they still there?" the operator asked. I don't know," Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't hear anything." "Stay where you are. The police should be there any second." Matt nodded, even though the operator couldn't see him. He kept his eyes locked on the door, the candlestick raised and ready just in case. The silence dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. Matt's nerves were frayed, every creak of the old building making him jump. He was on the edge of his sanity when he finally heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached. He let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him as the sirens drew closer. But then, just as he thought it was over, the doorknob rattled one last time. Matt's heart stopped. He raised the candlestick higher, ready to swing as the door creaked open ever so slightly, the lock finally giving way. But before it could open fully, there was a loud bang as the door was kicked open from the outside. The room flooded with light as two police officers burst in, guns drawn, shouting commands. "Police, get down!" Matt dropped the candlestick, his knees buckling as the relief washed over him. The officers quickly swept the apartment, but it was empty. Whoever had been trying to get in was gone. One of the officers came over to Matt, who was now sitting on the floor, trembling. "Are you okay? Did you see who it was?" Matt shook his head, still too shaken to speak. The officer nodded, understanding, and told him to stay put while they checked the building. It wasn't until much later, after the police had searched the entire brownstone and found no trace of the intruder, that Matt began to piece together what had happened. The person who had tried to break in had known his name, had known exactly where he was staying. The police suspected it was someone who had been watching him, someone who had planned this. Matt didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the sun came up, he packed his bags and left the apartment, vowing never to stay there again. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was would come back, that they were still out there, waiting for another chance. Boston was a beautiful city, but for Matt, it would always be tainted by the memory of that terrifying night. A night when the safety of his cozy apartment was shattered, and he was left wondering who had been lurking just beyond the door and why. Max had always loved the rain, so when he found an Airbnb in Seattle for a weekend getaway, he couldn't resist. The apartment was a cozy, modern loft in a quiet neighborhood, perfect for a relaxing weekend away from the stress of his job. It was located on the top floor of a renovated industrial building, offering a view of the city's iconic skyline and the constant drizzle that seemed to define Seattle. On his first night, Max settled in, enjoying the sound of raindrops pattering against the large windows. The loft was stylishly furnished, with exposed brick walls, sleek furniture, and a large, comfortable bed. After a long day of exploring the city, Max decided to turn in early. He double-checked that the door was locked, and even though it felt unnecessary, he engaged the deadbolt and the chain lock. It was a habit he had picked up living in New York. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard a faint sound coming from the living room. It was subtle, almost like the creak of a floorboard. Max sat up, his heart beginning to race. He told himself it was probably just the old building settling, but the sound had been too deliberate, too human. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the bedroom door. The living room was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of headlights on the street below. Max waited, holding his breath, but the sound didn't come again. After a few tense minutes, he convinced himself it was nothing and lay back down, trying to calm his nerves. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time Max closed his eyes, he felt a creeping sense of unease, like he was being watched. He tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to him, making the shadows in the room seem darker, more threatening. Then, just as he was about to drift off again, he heard it, a soft, almost inaudible rustling sound, followed by the unmistakable creak of the bedroom door slowly opening. Max's heart stopped. He hadn't heard any footsteps, no sound of someone approaching the door, but there it was, slowly swinging open. Max bolted upright, his phone's flashlight flicking back on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty hallway outside the bedroom. The door was open just a crack, but there was no one there. Max's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to move. When nothing happened, he forced himself out of bed, every instinct screaming at him to get out. He edged toward the door, the flashlight shaking in his trembling hand. With a quick, jerky motion, he threw the door wide open, expecting to see someone, something, standing there. But the hallway was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Max stepped out of the bedroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he hadn't imagined the door opening. Someone had to be in the apartment. He moved cautiously through the loft, checking every corner, every shadow, but the place was empty. As he reached the living room, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The front door, which he had locked and bolted, was now slightly ajar. Max stared at it, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was no way someone could have entered without making a sound, but the evidence was right in front of him. He approached the door slowly, his mind racing. Should he call the police? What would he even tell them? That he thought someone might have broken in, but there was no one there now. As he reached the door, he noticed something else. Muddy footprints leading from the door into the apartment. They were large, far too big to be his own, and they led directly into the bedroom. Max's heart leapt into his throat. He hadn't seen the footprints earlier, hadn't noticed them in his panicked search. But there they were, a clear trail leading from the door to the very room he had just been in. Without thinking, Max slammed the door shut and locked it, throwing the deadbolt and the chain into place with shaking hands. He stumbled back from the door, his eyes locked on the footprints. Someone had been in the apartment, someone who had managed to sneak in without making a sound and then vanished just as silently. Suddenly, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out, plunging the loft into darkness. Max's phone was his only source of light, and he fumbled with it, trying to keep the beam steady as he backed away from the door. Then he heard it, a low, rasping breath, close, too close. Max whipped around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly through the darkness, but it caught nothing. The sound came again, this time from behind him. He spun around, but the light revealed only empty space. Panic surged through him as he realized he was not alone. The air was thick with the presence of someone else, someone who was moving in the shadows just beyond the reach of his flashlight. Without thinking, Max bolted for the kitchen, desperate for something to defend himself with. He grabbed a large kitchen knife from the counter and held it out in front of him, the blade gleaming in the dim light of his phone. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. "I'll call the police." There was no answer, just the sound of that ragged breathing, now coming from the hallway. Max backed into the kitchen, his mind racing. He had to get out, had to find a way to escape. But the only exit was the front door, and whatever, or whoever, was in the apartment was blocking his path. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the loft, moving quickly toward him. Max's blood ran cold as he realized there was no time to think, no time to plan. He had to act. With a burst of adrenaline, Max charged toward the hallway, knife in hand. He swung the flashlight around, trying to catch a glimpse of his pursuer, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until Max could feel the floor vibrating beneath him. Just as he reached the hallway, something crashed into him from the side, knocking him off balance. He hit the floor hard, the knife skidding out of his hand. The flashlight flew from his grasp, spinning wildly across the floor, casting frantic beams of light as it went. Max scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his ears. The footsteps had stopped, but the air was thick with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. He reached for the knife, his fingers brushing the handle just as a shadow loomed over him. Before he could react, a hand clamped down on his wrist, cold and unyielding. Max tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat as the figure dragged him backward, away from the knife, away from the light. He kicked and struggled, but the grip was too strong. In a blind panic, he reached out, grabbing the only thing he could find, a heavy metal vase on the kitchen counter. With all his strength, he swung it at his attacker, feeling a sickening crunch as it connected. The grip on his wrist loosened, and Max broke free, stumbling toward the front door. He didn't stop to look back, didn't dare to. He threw the door open and sprinted down the hallway, not stopping until he was out of the building and into the rain-soaked streets of Seattle. He kept running, not daring to look back until he was several blocks away. When he finally stopped, gasping for breath, he looked back at the building. It loomed silently in the rain, the dark windows staring back at him like empty eyes. Max didn't return to the Airbnb. He didn't even go back for his things. He spent the rest of the night in a 24-hour diner, too shaken to even think about sleeping. When dawn finally broke, he booked the earliest flight out of Seattle and left the city behind. The next day, the Airbnb owner contacted him, angry about the broken vase and the mess in the apartment. But Max didn't care. He knew what he had experienced, and nothing could make him go back to that loft. To this day, Max can't explain what happened that night. He never saw the figure clearly, never found out who or what had been in the apartment with him. But he knew one thing for sure. He was never setting foot in Seattle again. Emily had been looking forward to her vacation in Charleston, South Carolina. She found a picturesque Airbnb on the coast, a cozy cottage perched right on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The photos were stunning. A quaint, weathered house with a wraparound porch, a stone path leading down to a private beach, and the endless sea stretching out to the horizon. The host, an older man named Tom, had been friendly during their brief phone conversation, assuring her that the cottage was the perfect spot for a peaceful getaway. Emily arrived late in the afternoon, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the water. She couldn't wait to relax, unwind, and forget about the stress of her job in the city. Tom greeted her at the door, handing over the keys with a warm smile. "You're going to love it here. It's peaceful, just you and the ocean." The cottage was everything Emily had hoped for. Rustic, yet comfortable, with a fireplace in the living room and large windows that offered breathtaking views of the sea. She unpacked her bags, fixed herself a drink, and settled on the porch to watch the sunset. As darkness fell, Emily noticed how isolated the cottage felt. The only sound was the crashing of waves against the cliffs below and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was calming at first, but as the night grew deeper, the silence became almost too intense, too all-encompassing. Emily brushed off her unease and went inside, deciding to get some sleep. The bedroom was cozy, with a large, old-fashioned bed and soft linens that smelled faintly of the sea. She crawled under the covers, the sound of the waves lulling her into a light sleep. She awoke suddenly in the middle of the night, her heart racing. She wasn't sure what had startled her, but the room was pitch black, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. She strained to listen, but all she could hear was the ocean outside. Then she heard it, a faint creaking, like someone stepping on old wooden floorboards. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The cottage was old, and she reasoned that it could just be the house settling, but the creaking continued, slow and deliberate, moving closer to her bedroom door. She quietly slipped out of bed, her pulse quickening. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, using the screen's light to navigate the darkness. The creaking had stopped, but now she could hear something else. Breathing, slow and heavy, just outside her door. Emily froze, her mind racing. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and Tom had assured her that the cottage was completely secluded. She silently cursed herself for choosing such an isolated spot. Summoning all her courage, she tiptoed to the bedroom door and pressed her ear against it. The breathing was still there, unmistakable and terrifying. Whoever it was, they were standing just inches away from her. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no weapon in the room, nothing she could use to defend herself. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything that could give her an advantage. The only option was the window, but it was a long drop to the rocky beach below. The door handle rattled, and Emily's blood ran cold. Whoever was outside was trying to get in. She backed up further, her hands trembling as she gripped her phone. The door didn't have a lock, and it was only a matter of time before the intruder forced their way in. In a flash of desperation, Emily yanked open the window and climbed out onto the narrow ledge. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't care. She carefully lowered herself down, her feet scraping against the rough stone of the cottage's exterior as she tried to find a foothold. Just as she dropped to the ground, she heard the bedroom door burst open above her. She didn't wait to see who it was. Emily sprinted across the yard, her bare feet digging into the wet grass as she headed for the beach path. The sound of footsteps pounded behind her, faster and more urgent. She could feel the intruder gaining on her, and the terror drove her to run harder than she ever had before. She reached the edge of the cliff, where the path began its steep descent to the beach. Without thinking, she plunged down the path, her body leaning into the slope as she raced toward the water. The footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. She risked a glance back and saw a shadowy figure, large and menacing, closing in on her. Panic surged through her veins as she pushed herself to move faster, the rocks and sand slipping under her feet. Finally, she reached the beach, the waves crashing violently against the shore. There was nowhere left to run, but Emily wasn't ready to give up. She bolted toward the water, hoping that somehow she could find safety in the sea. But the figure was too fast. Just as she reached the water's edge, a hand grabbed her arm, yanking her back with brutal force. Emily screamed, struggling against the iron grip, but the intruder was too strong. She was dragged back toward the cliff, away from the water and the faint hope of escape. The figure said nothing, his silence more terrifying than any words. Emily fought with every ounce of strength she had, but the struggle was hopeless. She was overpowered, forced to the ground as the waves crashed around her, their roar drowning out her desperate cries for help. The last thing she saw before the world went black was the endless, indifferent ocean stretching out into the darkness, offering no solace, no rescue.